September 18th, 1944. Holland, Operation Market Garden. Fallschirmjäger Obergefreiter Klaus Becker tumbled through the air, his parachute tangled and spinning uncontrollably. The 21-year-old German paratrooper had jumped from a Junkers Ju-52 transport during a desperate reinforcement mission, but his chute had malfunctioned at 300 feet. He hit the ground at nearly 40 miles per hour in an open field south of Arnhem, the impact shattering both his legs instantly. The pain was beyond anything Becker had experienced. Both femurs broken, his left tibia shattered, his right ankle crushed. He couldn't move, couldn't stand, could barely breathe through the agony. Around him, the battle raged as British and German forces fought for control of the bridges at Arnhem. Becker lay in the field alone and broken, knowing that broken legs in combat zones typically meant death from shock, infection, or simply being overrun and killed by enemy forces who couldn't spare resources for wounded enemies. 6 hours later, as darkness fell, American medics from the 101st Airborne Division found Becker while clearing wounded from the battlefield. The Americans weren't supposed to be in this sector, but the fluidity of Market Garden's fighting meant units operated wherever the tactical situation required. The medics, led by Staff Sergeant Robert Martinez, assessed Becker's injuries quickly. Both legs broken severely, the soldier in shock, but alive, and potentially savable if they could get him to proper medical facilities. "We're taking him," Martinez told his team. One of the medics hesitated. "Sarge, he's German. We've got our own wounded who need evacuation first. The aid station is overwhelmed." Martinez looked at the young German soldier, barely older than a teenager, lying helpless in the mud with injuries that would cripple him for life if not treated properly. "He's wounded. That makes him ours to care for. Get the stretcher." What Klaus Becker didn't know, what he couldn't understand as American medics carefully stabilized his shattered legs and evacuated him to a field hospital, was that he was about to receive medical care superior to anything the German military could provide. American military medicine in 1944 had advanced to the point where injuries that would have meant amputation or permanent disability just years earlier could now be treated successfully, restoring function and mobility that enemy medical systems couldn't match. And this young German paratrooper, who expected to die or be crippled permanently in an enemy field, would instead receive treatment so effective that 3 years later he would dance at his wedding, his legs healed so perfectly that his bride wouldn't know he'd ever been injured. To understand why Klaus Becker's treatment and recovery was so remarkable, we must first examine the state of military orthopedic medicine in 1944, the typical outcomes for soldiers with severe leg fractures, and the advances in American medical care that made full recovery from devastating injuries possible when such recovery had previously been rare or impossible. Military medicine throughout history had struggled with severe bone fractures, particularly compound fractures where broken bones pierced the skin. Before antibiotics, these injuries almost always became infected. Infection meant sepsis, and sepsis meant death or amputation. Even simple closed fractures, where bones broke without piercing skin, often healed improperly because battlefield conditions didn't allow proper immobilization and alignment during the critical healing period. World War I statistics illustrated the grim reality of severe fractures. Soldiers with compound leg fractures had approximately 60% mortality rates from infection and shock. Those who survived often required amputation to control infection. Those whose limbs were saved typically ended up with shortened, misaligned, or non-functional legs due to improper healing. The medical wisdom was that severe leg fractures in combat were potentially more dangerous than many bullet wounds because the infection and healing complications were so difficult to manage. By 1944, American military medicine had transformed orthopedic care through multiple innovations working together. Antibiotics to prevent infection, improved surgical techniques for bone alignment and fixation, better splinting and casting materials, systematic blood transfusion protocols to prevent shock, and most critically, rapid evacuation systems that got wounded soldiers to surgeons within hours rather than days. The American medical evacuation chain, which we've previously examined in our video on medical evacuation systems, meant that severely wounded soldiers like Klaus Becker reached surgical facilities extraordinarily quickly. In Becker's case, American medics found him within 6 hours of injury, stabilized him in the field, and evacuated him to a field hospital within 2 additional hours. By 8 hours after his injury, he was on an operating table being treated by an orthopedic surgeon. This speed was critical for successful treatment. Severe fractures cause shock through blood loss and pain. Shock, if not treated quickly, leads to organ damage and death. Fractures also begin healing immediately, often improperly, if bones aren't aligned correctly. Getting injured soldiers to surgeons within the golden hour, or at least within 12 hours, meant shock could be treated before becoming fatal, and bones could be aligned before improper healing began. The surgeon who treated Klaus Becker was Captain David Steinberg, an orthopedic specialist from Johns Hopkins Hospital who had volunteered for military service and been assigned to the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment's medical detachment. Steinberg had trained in the latest orthopedic techniques, including open reduction and internal fixation, a surgical procedure where surgeons cut open the fracture site, manually align the broken bones under direct vision, then install metal pins, plates, or screws to hold the bones in proper alignment while healing occurs. This technique was revolutionary compared to traditional closed reduction, where doctors manipulated broken bones from outside the body, then immobilized the limb in a cast, hoping the bones stayed aligned. Closed reduction worked for simple fractures, but often failed for complex fractures with multiple bone fragments or severe displacement. Open reduction allowed precise alignment and secure fixation, dramatically improving healing outcomes. Becker's injuries were severe enough that Steinberg decided open reduction was necessary. Both femurs were broken with significant displacement. The left tibia was shattered into multiple fragments. The right ankle had crushed bones that needed reconstruction. Without surgery, these injuries would heal improperly if they healed at all, leaving Becker crippled even if he survived. The surgery took 5 hours. Steinberg opened Becker's left leg first, exposing the shattered tibia. He carefully aligned the bone fragments like a 3-dimensional puzzle, using X-rays taken before surgery as guides. Once satisfied with the alignment, he installed a steel intramedullary rod, a long pin inserted through the bone's hollow center that held the fragments in proper position. For the femur fractures, he used steel plates screwed to the bones, providing rigid fixation that would maintain alignment during healing. The right ankle reconstruction was particularly delicate. Crushed ankle bones required removing some damaged fragments, reshaping others, and pinning the remaining bones in positions that would preserve joint function. Steinberg worked carefully, knowing that ankle mobility was critical for walking normally. If the ankle healed stiff or misaligned, Becker might walk, but would limp significantly. Throughout the surgery, Becker received blood transfusions to replace blood lost during the operation and treat shock. He received penicillin, the revolutionary antibiotic that had only recently become available in sufficient quantities for widespread military use to prevent infection. The combination of antibiotics, blood transfusion, and skilled surgery gave Becker survival chances approaching 95%, compared to perhaps 40% with German military medicine and maybe 10% with World War I-era treatment. After surgery, Becker was transferred to a POW hospital facility where he would remain for months during healing. His legs were casted in positions that maintained proper alignment while allowing the surgical repairs to heal. He received additional penicillin doses to ensure no infection developed. He received physical therapy to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain joint mobility in his uninjured areas. The first weeks were agonizing. Surgical pain, immobilization, and the psychological stress of being a prisoner in enemy hands, while unable to move, combined to make Becker wonder if survival was worth the suffering. He spoke minimal English, and most American medical staff spoke no German. The barrier made communication difficult and increased his sense of isolation and fear. But a German-speaking American chaplain, Lieutenant Father Thomas Weber, visited Becker regularly. Weber had emigrated from Germany in 1935 and served as a translator and counselor for German POWs. Through Weber, Becker learned that the surgery had gone well, that his legs should heal properly, and that American doctors expected him to walk again, possibly even normally. Becker asked through Weber, "I will need cane?" Weber translated for Captain Steinberg, who had come to check on his patient. Steinberg examined the X-rays showing the surgical repairs, checked Becker's circulation and sensation, then spoke while Weber translated. "If healing proceeds as expected, you will walk without assistance and without limping. Your left leg may be slightly shorter than your right, perhaps 1 centimetre, but this won't be noticeable. Your ankle mobility will be reduced, perhaps 80% of normal, but you'll be able to walk, run if necessary, and live normally. You won't be crippled." Becker didn't believe this initially. He had seen German soldiers with severe leg fractures. They limped, used canes, or had shortened legs that caused permanent disability. The idea that he could recover completely seemed like kind lies told to prisoners to keep their morale up. But as weeks passed, and his pain decreased, and his surgeons seemed genuinely confident about the prognosis, Becker began to hope. The healing process took 6 months. Becker remained in casts for 3 months, while bones healed around the surgical fixation. During this time, he received regular X-rays to monitor healing progress, physical therapy to maintain upper body strength and prevent complications, and continued medical care that treated him as a patient rather than a prisoner. The American medical staff never made him feel like an enemy. He was a wounded soldier who needed care, and they provided that care with professionalism and compassion that surprised him. When the casts finally came off, Becker's legs were thin and weak from months of immobilization, but the bones had healed in proper alignment. The surgical scars were prominent but clean, showing no sign of infection. Steinberg examined the healed fractures, checked joint mobility, assessed bone alignment, then smiled. Perfect healing. The bones are solid. Physical therapy was brutal. Muscles that hadn't been used for months needed to be retrained. Joints that had been immobilized needed to regain full range of motion. Becker worked with American physical therapists who pushed him harder than he thought possible, making him stand when he wanted to sit, making him walk when he wanted to rest, forcing him to regain capabilities he'd thought were lost forever. 6 months after his injury, Klaus Becker walked without assistance for the first time. His gait was uneven and cautious, but he walked. No cane, no crutches, just his own legs carrying his weight. He cried the first time he crossed the ward without help, overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief that this recovery was possible. 9 months after injury, Becker could walk normally enough that observers wouldn't know he'd been injured. A slight reduction in his right ankle mobility affected how he ran but didn't impair normal walking. The leg length discrepancy Steinberg had predicted was minimal and unnoticeable. For all practical purposes, he had recovered completely from injuries that should have crippled him permanently or killed him. By this time, the war had ended. Germany had surrendered. Becker, like millions of German POWs, faced the question of what to do with his life in a defeated nation. The Americans offered POWs opportunities to work in labor programs, earning money and learning skills while waiting for repatriation. Becker worked in construction, his healed legs allowing him to perform physical labor that wouldn't have been possible if his injuries had healed improperly. In 1946, Becker was repatriated to Germany. He returned to his hometown near Munich, found his family's home damaged but standing, and began rebuilding his life. He used his construction experience from POW labor to find work as a carpenter. And he met Anna, a young woman whose own family had survived the war and who didn't care that Klaus had fought for Germany or been captured or broken both legs. She cared that he was kind, hard-working, and alive when so many weren't. They married in 1947. At the wedding reception, traditional German music played, and Klaus danced with his bride. He moved carefully at first, testing his legs, feeling the slight stiffness in his right ankle, but finding that it didn't prevent him from moving to the music. Anna looked up at him and smiled. Klaus smiled back. "American doctors. They fixed me properly." "We should thank them someday," Anna said. "Someday," Klaus agreed. That chance came in 1962 when Klaus and Anna took their first vacation outside Germany, traveling to the United States to visit relatives who had emigrated before the war. While in Washington, D.C., Klaus contacted the Veterans Administration, asking if there was any way to locate Captain David Steinberg, the surgeon who had operated on him 18 years earlier. The VA located Steinberg, now a civilian orthopedic surgeon practicing in Baltimore. They arranged a meeting, and Klaus traveled to Steinberg's office with Anna and his 2 children. When Steinberg entered the waiting room and Klaus stood to greet him, the surgeon studied Klaus's gait carefully, then smiled with obvious satisfaction. "Perfect healing. I can't even tell which legs were injured." Klaus, speaking now in carefully practiced English, thanked Steinberg for saving his legs and enabling him to live a normal life. He introduced his wife and children, explaining that without Steinberg's skill, he might not have been able to work, to marry, to have this family. Steinberg was moved by the gratitude, but insisted that Klaus's own determination during physical therapy deserved more credit than surgical skill. "I aligned the bones and installed the hardware. You did the hard work of healing and rehabilitation." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Klaus showed photographs of his wedding, his children, his life in Germany. Steinberg showed X-rays he had kept from the original surgery, explaining what he had done and why. They discussed how orthopedic medicine had continued to advance, how techniques pioneered in military medicine during the war had improved civilian trauma care. As Klaus prepared to leave, he asked Steinberg a question that had bothered him for years. "Why did you work so hard to save my legs? I was enemy. I was prisoner. You could have amputated, which is faster and easier." Steinberg considered the question carefully before answering. "You were wounded soldier, not enemy. My oath as doctor is to heal, not to judge who deserves healing. Your nationality didn't matter. Your injuries did, and I knew that with proper treatment you could recover fully." This answer captured the fundamental principle that had guided American military medicine during World War II: treat the wounded regardless of whose uniform they wore, because healing was a moral imperative transcending politics and war. The statistics supported that this wasn't just Steinberg's personal philosophy, but systematic American medical practice. German and Italian POWs in American captivity received medical care essentially identical to American wounded. Mortality rates for severe injuries were similar between Allied soldiers and Axis POWs, indicating that treatment quality didn't vary based on nationality. This was radically different from German and Japanese medical practices, where enemy wounded often received minimal or no care, and where medical resources were reserved for their own forces. The outcomes of this approach proved its effectiveness. German POWs with severe injuries treated by American medicine showed recovery rates far exceeding what German military medicine achieved. Follow-up studies after the war found that German soldiers treated for fractures by American surgeons had better long-term outcomes, less disability, and higher quality of life than comparable German soldiers treated by their own medical services. Klaus Becker's case was exceptional in its completeness of recovery, but not unique in demonstrating American medical capability. Thousands of German and Italian POWs received orthopedic care, received antibiotics that prevented infection, received surgeries that saved limbs and restored function. Many, like Klaus, returned home after the war with injuries healed so well that they could resume normal lives. The contrast with German military medicine was stark. German wounded with similar fractures often suffered infection because Germany never produced penicillin in useful quantities. Their surgeons had skill comparable to American surgeons, but lacked antibiotics, lacked adequate blood transfusion capacity, and operated in hospitals overwhelmed by casualties that far exceeded German medical system capacity. A German soldier with Klaus Becker's injuries, treated by German medicine, would have perhaps 60% chance of losing at least one leg to amputation and maybe 40% chance of dying from complications. The implications extended beyond individual cases. A military with superior medical care could take greater tactical risks because wounded soldiers would likely survive and recover. American commanders knew that soldiers who were wounded would receive excellent care and many would return to duty. This knowledge affected tactical decisions and soldier morale. Soldiers fought more aggressively when they knew that being wounded didn't mean death or permanent disability. German soldiers, particularly late in the war when German medical system deteriorated under overwhelming casualties and resource shortages, knew that being wounded likely meant death or crippling disability. This knowledge affected morale and willingness to take risks in combat. Why advance aggressively when being wounded might mean bleeding to death before medics arrived or dying from infection in an overwhelmed hospital? The post-war implications of American medical treatment of German POWs were significant for Cold War politics. Thousands of Germans returned home after the war with personal experiences of American generosity and medical capability. They told friends and family about receiving care that saved their lives or limbs, about American doctors who treated enemy soldiers with the same care as their own wounded. These testimonies countered Soviet propaganda claiming that Americans were cruel capitalists who would exploit and abuse Germans. Klaus Becker became one of many German veterans who spoke positively about American treatment when asked. He worked in construction for 35 years, raised 3 children, enjoyed hobbies including hiking that wouldn't have been possible with crippled legs, and lived to age 84 before dying peacefully in 2007. He attended several German-American friendship events, meeting other veterans, sharing stories, contributing to reconciliation between former enemies. At his funeral, his daughter read a letter Klaus had written years earlier but never sent to Captain Steinberg, who had died in 1998. The letter thanked Steinberg again for giving Klaus a full life, for treating an enemy soldier with compassion and skill, for embodying the best of what medicine and humanity could achieve even in wartime. "You saved my legs so I could dance at my wedding," the letter concluded. "But you gave me more than that. You gave me the ability to work, to provide for my family, to hike with my children, to live without disability. You gave me a full life when I expected to be crippled or dead. I never found adequate words to thank you. This letter, this life, this story of a young German paratrooper who fell from the sky and broke both legs and received medical care so excellent that he healed perfectly and danced at his wedding represented American military medicine at its best. Not just the technical skill, though that was considerable. Not just the antibiotics and surgical techniques, though those were revolutionary. But the fundamental commitment to healing regardless of nationality, the belief that wounded soldiers deserved care whether they were allies or enemies, and the systematic excellence of American military medicine that turned these beliefs into outcomes that saved lives and restored function on scales no other military achieved. Klaus Becker danced at his wedding because American medics found him in a field and decided he was worth saving. Because an American surgeon spent 5 hours carefully reconstructing shattered bones. Because American physical therapists pushed him through brutal rehabilitation. Because American military medicine operated according to principles that valued healing over nationality, and believed that every wounded soldier, regardless of whose uniform he wore, deserved the best care available. That commitment, multiplied across thousands of German and Italian POWs who received similar care, across millions of American soldiers who knew their own wounded would receive excellent treatment, across allies who observed American medical capabilities and adopted similar standards, represented American values in action. The United States didn't just fight with superior weapons and greater industrial capacity. America fought with superior medicine that saved lives and restored function, and treated enemies as wounded humans deserving care rather than as targets deserving death. And decades later, when an elderly German carpenter told his grandchildren about falling from the sky and breaking both legs and being healed by American doctors so perfectly that he could dance at their grandmother's wedding, he was bearing witness to what those values achieved. Not just military victory, though America achieved that. Not just technological superiority, though America demonstrated that. But something more important. Humanity in warfare, compassion toward enemies, and medical excellence that transcended politics to fulfill medicine's fundamental purpose of healing whoever needs healing, regardless of who they are or whose side they fought on.